Chapter 2, Theoretical Disciplines as the Foundation of Normative Disciplines. 13. The controversy regarding the practical character of logic. Our last discussions have given so obvious a justification to the view of logic as a technology, that it might seem remarkable that there should ever have been controversy on this point. A practically oriented logic is an indispensable postulate of all the sciences, and this corresponds to the historical fact that logic arose out of practical motives connected with the business of science. This we know happened in those thought-stirring times when the young, budding science of the Greeks was in danger of succumbing to the attacks of sophists and subjectivists, when all its future success depended on finding objective criteria of truth, which might destroy the cheating illusions of the sophistical dialectic. In modern times, mainly under the influence of Kant, there have been repeated denials that logic is a technology, though such a characterization has, on the other hand, been held to have some value. This dispute cannot have turned on the mere question whether it is possible to give logic practical aims, and so to conceive of it as a practical discipline. Kant himself spoke of an applied logic which should have as its task the regulation of the use of the understanding under the contingent conditions of the subject, which might hinder or assist it. Critique of Pure Reason, Intro to Trans. Logic, I, last paragraph of 54/B78-9, and from which we might learn what promotes the correct use of the understanding, what assists it and what cures it from logical mistakes and errors. Kant's Logic, Introduction to, Hartenstein's edition 1867, 8, B18. Though he is not willing to let it rank, with pure logic, as an authentic science, though he even thinks that it should not properly be called logic, Critique of Pure Reason, work, E.D. Hartenstein, 3, p. 83, everyone is nonetheless at liberty to extend the aim of logic so as to include applied, practical logic. 1. It may in any case be disputed, as has in fact frequently happened, whether great gain can be hoped for from logic as a practical theory of science, whether, for example, one could really hope for such great revolutions and advances from an extension of the old logic, which could only serve to test given knowledge, into an ars inventiva, a logic of discovery, as Leibniz is known to have believed, etc. This dispute, however, concerns no point important in principle, and it is settled by the clear maxim that even the moderate probability of a future advance in the sciences justifies us in working on a normative discipline pledged to this end, without regard to the fact that the rules we deduce represent a valuable enrichment of knowledge. The genuinely disputed question of important principle, to which neither side has given precision, lies in quite a different direction, whether the definition of logic as a technology really touches its essential character. We ask, in other words, if it is only a practical standpoint that establishes the right of logic to count as a peculiar scientific discipline, while, from a theoretical standpoint, all the findings accumulated by logic consist, on the one hand, in purely theoretical propositions having their original home in otherwise known theoretical sciences, and mainly in psychology, and, on the other hand, in rules based on these theoretical propositions. The essence of Kant's conception of logic does not, in fact, lie in the fact that he disputes the practical character of logic, but that he believes in the possibility and the epistemologically basic character of a certain delimitation or restriction of logic, which would make of it a wholly independent science, one which, in comparison with otherwise known sciences, is wholly new and entirely theoretical, and which, like mathematics, stands outside of any thought of possible application, in being an a priori, purely demonstrative discipline. The restriction of logic to its theoretic knowledge content leads, on the prevailing form of the doctrine opposed to Kant's, to psychological and perhaps also grammatical and other propositions, i.e. to small excerpts from otherwise delimited, and, let us add, empirical sciences. Whereas, on Kant's view, we rather dig down to an internally closed, independent and, let us add, a priori field of theoretical knowledge, to pure logic. It is apparent that other weighty oppositions are at work in these doctrines, whether logic should count as an a priori or an empirical science, as an independent or dependent science, as a demonstrative or non-demonstrative science. If we drop these questions as remote from our immediate interests, only the above-mentioned point of dispute remains. On one side we abstract the assertion that under every logic thought of as a technology lies a peculiar theoretical discipline, a pure logic, whereas, on the other view, all theoretical doctrines admitted into the logical technology are held to be classifiable in otherwise known theoretical sciences. The second point of view was stoutly defended by Benedict II, and J. Stuart Mill stated it clearly in his Logic, which has also been influential in this respect. 3. Sigwart's Logic, the leading contribution to recent logical work in Germany, also stands on similar ground. Clearly and decisively it is there said, the highest task of logic, and the one which constitutes its real essence, is to be a technical discipline. 4. On the other side we have, in addition to Kant, principally Herbart, and a large number of their disciples. How easily the most extreme empiricism accords in this respect with Kant's conception is seen from Bain's Logic, which, constructed as a technology, expressly acknowledges, and claims to include, a logic which is a peculiar, abstract, theoretical discipline, a science of the same sort as mathematics. This theoretical discipline is held by Bain to rest on psychology. It is not thought of, as by Kant, to precede all other sciences as an absolutely independent science. But it remains a science on its own account. It is not, as Mill would have it, a mere assemblage of psychological chapters, offered with the intention to regulate knowledge practically. 5. In the many treatments which logic has received this century, the point of difference here in question has hardly ever been clearly emphasized and carefully considered. Since the practical treatment of logic accords with either standpoint, and is generally admitted to be useful on either, the whole dispute as to the essentially practical or theoretical character of logic has seemed meaningless to many. They have never in fact been clear as to how the standpoints differ. We are not required by our purposes to go critically into the disputes of older logicians as to whether logic is an art or a science or both, and whether, in the second case, it is a practical or speculative science or both. On these questions, and on the value of these questions, Sir William Hamilton has pronounced as follows: the controversy is perhaps one of the most futile in the history of speculation. In so far as logic is concerned, the decision of the question is not of the very smallest import. It was not in consequence of any diversity of opinion in regard to the scope and nature of this doctrine, that philosophers disputed by what name it should be called. The controversy was, in fact, only about what was properly an art, and what was properly a science, and as men attached one meaning or another to these terms, so did they affirm logic to be an art, or a science, or both, or neither. Lectures on Logic, ed. 3, Volume I, 1884, pp. 9-10. One must note, however, that Hamilton himself did not dig very deeply into the content and value of the distinctions and controversies in question. If there were appropriate agreement as to the way to treat logic, and the content of the doctrines to be attributed to it, the question if and how the concepts art and science entered into its definition, would be of minor importance, though by no means a mere question of labeling. But the dispute over the definition, as we have already maintained, is really a dispute regarding the science itself, and one not regarding the completed science but the provisionally pretended one, the one still in progress, whose methods, doctrines, in short everything, are still in doubt. Even in Hamilton's day, and long before, men differed considerably as to the essential content, the scope and the manner of treatment of logic. One need only compare the works of Hamilton, Bolzano, Mill and Bennick. And how the differences have grown since then. Put together Erdmann and Drubisch, Wundt and Berman, Scoop and Brentano, Sigwart and Oberweig, and ask whether one then has a single science, or only a single name. One might settle for the latter, if there were not occasionally some more comprehensive groups of common themes, though in respect of the doctrine, and even the problems, no two logicians reach a tolerable understanding among themselves. If we associate with this the point stressed in the introduction, that definitions of logic merely express beliefs as to its essential tasks and methodical character, and that errors and prejudices on these points can help to mislead so retarded a science onto wrong paths of research, we shall certainly not agree with Hamilton in saying that the decision of the question is not of the very smallest import. Confusion has not a little been promoted by the fact that even distinguished protagonists of the autonomy of a pure logic, such as Drobische and Bergman, have put the normative character of the discipline among the features essential to its notion. Their opponents saw in this a patent inconsequence, even a contradiction. Has not the concept of normativity got an inherent relation to a guiding aim, and to activities devoted to it? Does not a normative science mean exactly the same as a technology? The manner in which Drobische introduces and conceives his determinations merely confirms these impressions. In his ever-valuable logic we read, there are two angles from which thought can be made the object of a scientific investigation, as an activity of mind whose conditions and laws may be looked into, and as a tool for acquiring mediate knowledge, permitting both of a correct and a faulty use, and leading in the one case to true, in the other to false results. There are therefore both natural and normal laws for thinking, and the latter are prescriptions, norms, to which one must direct oneself to reach these results. The investigation of the natural laws of thinking is a task for psychology, whereas the establishment of its normal rules is the task of logic, Neudarstellung der Logik, 2, p3. And to this the further more than sufficient explanation is added. Normal rules always regulate an activity in conformity with a certain end. On the other hand, one might say, here nothing is said to which Bennick or Mill could not subscribe, and which they could not adapt to their own advantage. If we grant the identity of the concepts normative discipline and technology, it is obvious that, as in the case of technologies in general, it is not the mutual connectedness of matters but our guiding aim which serves to bind and unite logical truths into a discipline. It is then plainly wrong to set logic bounds as narrow as those of the traditional Aristotelian logic, since pure logic certainly goes beyond these. It is absurd to set logic a goal, and then to exclude from it classes of norms and normative investigations that pertain to this goal. The exponents of pure logic still live under the spell of tradition. The marvelous magic distilled by the hollow formularies hawked about by the school logic down the ages, still works powerfully in them. Such is the list of obvious objections likely to turn modern interest from a closer discussion of the objective reasons which have weighed with great, independent thinkers in favor of an autonomous science of pure logic, and which still call for serious probing. The worthy Drobische may have gone wrong in his statement, but this does not prove that his position, or that of his master Herbart, or that ultimately of his prime inspirer Kant 6 was in essence misguided. It does not even rule out the possibility that a valuable thought, that has not achieved conceptually clear expression, may lie hidden under his imperfect statement. Let us dwell on the coordination of logic with pure mathematics, of which the champions of pure logic are so fond. The mathematical disciplines also yield a basis for technologies. To arithmetic corresponds the practical art of calculation, to geometry the art of land surveying. Technologies are similarly connected, though somewhat differently, with the abstract theoretical natural sciences, physical technologies with physics, chemical technologies with chemistry. This readily suggests the view that it is the true sense of our supposed pure logic to be an abstract theoretical discipline providing a basis for a technology just as the previously mentioned disciplines do, its technology being logic in the ordinary, practical sense. And just as technologies sometimes have one main, basic, theoretical discipline from which their norms flow, sometimes several such basic disciplines, so logic, taken as a technology, might depend on a plurality of such disciplines, and have pure logic merely as one, though perhaps the most important one, of its basic disciplines. Possibly it could be further shown that logical laws and forms, in the pregnant sense of these words, belong to a theoretically closed round of abstract truth, that cannot in any way be fitted into previously delimited theoretical disciplines and so must themselves be regarded as the pure logic in question. We should then be led to suppose that defects in the conceptual definition of this discipline, and the inability to present it in its purity, and clearly state its relation to logic as a technology, have favored its confusion with this technology, and have made possible the dispute as to whether logic should be defined as being essentially a theoretical or a practical discipline. While the one party trained its sights on purely theoretical propositions that were logical in the pregnant sense, the other party stuck to the vulnerable definitions of the pretended theoretical science, and the manner in which it was actually carried out. To object that we are attempting to restore the Aristotelian scholastic logic, on whose worthlessness history has pronounced judgment, will not perturb us. Possibly it may yet appear that the discipline in question is by no means so narrow in scope, and so poor in profound problems, as it is here approached with being. Possibly traditional logic was merely a highly imperfect, distorted realization of the idea of pure logic, but nonetheless sound and respectable as a first onslaught and initiative. One may also ask whether our scorn for the traditional logic is not perhaps an unjustifiable after effect of Renaissance attitudes, whose motives no longer touch us. It is understandable that the historically justified, but in reality often foolish battle, against scholastic science, should be above all directed against its logic, its characteristic doctrine of method. But that formal logic should, in the hands of scholasticism, particularly decadent scholasticism, have taken on the character of a false methodology, perhaps only shows the lack of a correct philosophical understanding of logical theory, as so far developed. The practical use of this logic therefore entered mistaken pathways, and methodological achievements were attributed to it for which it is in essence unqualified. In the same way, number mysticism proves nothing against arithmetic. The logical polemics of the Renaissance are well known to have been void of substance or effect. They are the utterances of passion, not of insight. Why should we still yield ourselves to the guidance of such scornful utterances? A theoretically creative mind like Leibniz, in whom the enthusiastic reformatory zeal of the Renaissance went together with a sober, scientific, modern spirit, would hear nothing of abating or harrying of scholasticism. With warm words he took the despised Aristotelian logic to his bosom, however much he thought it needed extension and improvement. We can in any case quietly leave aside the reproach that pure logic represents a revival of hollow, formal, scholastic truck, while we have not yet become clear as to the sense and content of the discipline in question, nor as to the justification of the surmises that have suggested themselves to us. In order to test these surmises, we do not intend to assemble and to subject to a critical analysis any and every argument historically advanced for this or that conception of logic. This would not be a way to give new interest to an old dispute. The oppositions of principle which were not properly sorted out in this dispute have, however, their own interest, and this interest rises above the empirical limitations of the disputants. It is these oppositions that we have to track down. 14. The concept of a normative science. The basic standard or principle that gives it unity we begin by concentrating on a proposition that is of decisive importance for our further investigation, that every normative and likewise every practical discipline rests on one or more theoretical disciplines, inasmuch as its rules must have a theoretical content separable from the notion of normativity, of the shall or should, whose scientific investigation is the duty of these theoretical disciplines. To clear up this point, let us first discuss the concept of a normative science in its relation to that of a theoretical science. The laws of the former tell us, it is usually held, what shall or should be, though perhaps, under the actual circumstances, it neither is nor can be. The laws of the latter, contrariwise, merely tell us what is. We must now ask what is meant by such a shall be or should be as opposed to what is. The original sense of shall or should, which relates to a certain wish or will, a certain demand or command, is plainly too narrow. For example, you shall listen to me, X shall come to me. As we speak in a wider sense of a demand, where there is no one who demands, and perhaps no one on whom demand is made, so we frequently speak of a shall or a should which is independent of anyone's wishing or willing. If we say a soldier should be brave, this does not mean that we or anyone else are wishing or willing, commanding or requiring this. One might rather suppose that a corresponding wishing and requiring would be generally justified, i.e. in relation to every soldier, though even this is not quite right, since it is surely not necessary that we should here be really evaluating a wish or a demand. A soldier should be brave rather means that only a brave soldier is a good soldier, which implies, since the predicates good and bad divide up the extension of the concept soldier, that a soldier who is not brave is a bad soldier. Since this value judgment holds, everyone is entitled to demand of a soldier that he should be brave. The same ground ensures that it is desirable, praiseworthy, etc., that he should be brave. The same holds in other instances. A man should practice neighborly love, i.e. one who omits this is no longer a good man, and therefore eo ipso is, in this respect, a bad man. A drama should not break up into episodes, otherwise it is not a good drama, not a true work of art. In all these cases we make our positive evaluation, the attribution of a positive value predicate, depend on a condition to be fulfilled, whose non-fulfillment entails the corresponding negative predicate. We may in general, take as identical or at least as equivalent the forms an A should be B and an A that is not B is a bad A, or only an A which is A B is a good A. The term good naturally functions in the widest sense of what is in any way valuable. In the concrete propositions ranged under our formula it is to be understood in the specific sense of the valuations it presupposes, for example as useful, beautiful, moral, etc. There are as many ways of speaking of a should as there are different species of valuations, as there are, in consequence, actual or presumed values. Negative statements of what should not be are not to be taken as negations of the corresponding affirmative statements, as, to, in the ordinary sense, the denial of a demand does not amount to a prohibition. A soldier should not be cowardly does not mean that it is false that a soldier should be cowardly, but that a cowardly soldier also is a bad one. The following forms are therefore equivalent: an A should not be B, and an A which is bis in general a bad A, or only an A which is not bis a good A. That should and should not are mutually exclusive follows formally from their interpretations, and the same holds of the proposition that judgments regarding what should be entail no assertion regarding what correspondingly is. The just clarified judgments of normative form are plainly not the only ones that one would allow to count as such, even if the word should or shall does not occur in their expression. It is an essential if, instead of saying a should, or should not, be B we also are able to say a must, or may not, be B. We touch more substance if we point to the two new formulae a need not be B and a may be B, which are in contradictory opposition to the above forms. May not is therefore the negation of should, or, what is the same, of must, may the negation of should not or, what is the same, of may not, as can readily be seen from the interpreting value judgments. An A need not be B equals an A that is not bis not therefore a bad A, an A may be B equals an A that is bis not therefore a bad A. There are yet other propositions that must be reckoned with here, for example for an A to be a good A it suffices, or does not suffice, that it is B. Whereas our former propositions are about certain necessary conditions for attributing or denying positive or negative value predicates, our concern in the present proposition is with sufficient conditions. Other further propositions aim at stating what are at once necessary and sufficient conditions. We have thus run through the essential forms of general normative propositions. To them of course correspond forms of particular and singular value judgment which contribute nothing of importance to our analysis, and of which the latter at least do not count for our purposes. They have always a nearer or remoter relation to certain normative generalities. In abstract normative disciplines, they can only occur in relation to their governing generalities. Such disciplines are as such located beyond all individual existence. Their generalities are purely conceptual. They have a law-like character in the strict sense of the word law. We see from these analyses that each normative proposition presupposes a certain sort of valuation or approval through which the concept of a good or bad, a value or a disvalue, arises in connection with a certain class of objects. In conformity with this, objects divide into good and bad ones. To be able to pass a normative judgment a soldier should be brave, I must have some conception of a good soldier, and this concept cannot be founded on an arbitrary nominal definition, but on a general valuation, which permits us to value soldiers as good or bad according to these or those properties. Whether or not this valuation is in any sense objectively valid, whether we can draw any distinction between the subjectively and objectively good, does not enter into our determination of the sense of should propositions. It is sufficient that something is held valuable, that an intention is effected having the content that something is valuable or good. If, conversely, a pair of value predicates has been laid down for an appropriate class, following upon a certain general valuation, then the possibility of normative judgments is given. All forms of normative proposition have then definite sense. Every constitutive property B of the good A yields, for example a proposition of the form an A should be B, every property incompatible with B, a proposition an A may not, should not, be B etc. Finally, as regards the concept of the normative judgment we can, following our analysis, describe it as follows, in relation to a general underlying valuation, and the content of the corresponding pair of value predicates determined by it. Every proposition is said to be normative that states a necessary, or a sufficient, or a necessary and sufficient condition for having such a predicate. If we have once drawn a distinction between good and bad in our valuations in a particular sense, and so in a particular sphere, we are naturally concerned to decide the circumstances, the inner or outer properties that are or are not guarantees that a thing is good or bad in this sense, what properties may not be lacking if an object from that sphere is to be accorded the value of good. Where we speak of good and bad, we also usually make comparative valuation or distinctions between better and best or between worse and worst. If pleasure is our good, then the more intense, and again the more enduring, pleasure is better. If knowledge counts as our good, not every piece of knowledge will therefore count as equally good. We value the knowledge of laws more highly than the knowledge of singular facts, the knowledge of more general laws, for example every equation of the nth degree has n roots, more highly than the knowledge of the special laws that fall under them, every equation of the fourth degree has 4 roots. There are therefore normative questions relating to relative value predicates just as there are in the case of absolute value predicates. If the constitutive content of what is to be esteemed good or bad is fixed, one must ask what, in comparative valuation, will count constitutively as better or worse, and, further, what are the nearer and the more remote, the necessary and the sufficient conditions for the relative predicates, laying down the content of the better and worse, and ultimately of the relatively best. The constitutive contents of positive and relative value predicates are, so to say, the metric units in terms of which objects of the relevant sphere are measured. The sum total of these norms plainly forms a closed group, determined by our fundamental valuation. The normative proposition which demands generally of the objects of a sphere that they should measure up to the constitutive features of the positive value predicate to the greatest extent possible, has a central place in each group of mutually coherent norms, and can be called their basic norm. This role is, for example, played by the categorical imperative in the group of normative propositions which make up Kant's ethics, as by the principle of the greatest possible happiness of the greatest possible number in the ethics of the utilitarians. The basic norm is the correlate of the definition of good and bad in the sense in question. It tells us on what basic standard or basic value all normativization must be conducted, and does not therefore represent a normative proposition in the strict sense. The relationship of the basic norm to what are, properly speaking, normative propositions, is like the relation between so-called definitions of the number series and the arithmetical theorems about the relations of numbers which are always referred back to these. The basic norm could also be called a definition of the standard conception of good, for example of the morally good, but this would mean departing from the ordinary logical concept of definition. If, in relation to such a definition, or fundamental and universal valuation, we make it our aim to conduct scientific researches into a sum total of mutually relevant normative propositions, we come upon the idea of a normative discipline. Each such discipline is therefore unambiguously characterized by its basic norm, or by the definition of what shall count as good in such a discipline. If, for example, the production, maintenance, increase and intensification of pleasure counts as our good, we shall ask by what objects, or in what subjective and objective circumstances, pleasure is excited. We shall inquire generally into the necessary and sufficient conditions for the emergence, maintenance, increase etc., of pleasure. These questions taken as targets for our scientific discipline yield a hedonic. This hedonic is normative ethics in the sense of the hedonists. The valuation directed to the arousal of pleasure yields the basic norm which determines the unity of the discipline and distinguishes it from every other normative discipline. Every normative discipline therefore has its own basic norm which is in each case its unifying principle. Theoretical disciplines do not have this central reference of all researches to a fundamental valuation as the source of a dominant normative interest. The unity of their researches, and the coordination of what they know, is determined exclusively by a theoretical interest directed to investigating matters that really belong together theoretically, in virtue of the inner laws of things, and which must therefore be investigated together in their mutual coherence. 15 normative disciplines and technologies. A normative interest is naturally dominant in the case of real objects, as the objects of practical valuations. Hence the undeniable tendency to identify the notion of a normative discipline with that of a practical discipline or a technology. It is easy to see, however, that such an identification cannot be sustained. Schopenhauer, for example, who is led by his doctrine of inborn character to reject in principle all practical moralizing, has an ethics in the sense of a normative science, which he himself works out. For he does not at all abandon distinctions in moral value. A technology represents a particular case of a normative discipline which arises when the basic norm consists in achieving a universal practical aim. Plainly, therefore, every technology includes in itself an entire normative discipline, which is not itself a practical discipline. For its task presupposes that, altogether apart from everything relating to practical attainment, the narrow task of fixing norms has first been carried out, norms by which we can assess the adequacy to the general notion of the end to be achieved, or the possession of the properties characteristic of the class of values in question. Every normative discipline, conversely, whose fundamental valuation is transformed into a corresponding teleological prescription, widens out into a technology. 16 theoretical disciplines as the foundation of normative disciplines. It is now easy to see that each normative, and, a fortiori, each practical discipline, presupposes one or more theoretical disciplines as its foundations, in the sense, namely, that it must have a theoretical content free from all normativity, which as such has its natural location in certain theoretical sciences, whether these are already marked off or yet to be constituted. The basic norm, or basic value, or ultimate end, determines, we saw, the unity of the discipline. It also is what imports the thought of normativity into all its normative propositions. But alongside of this general thought of measurement in terms of a basic norm, these propositions have their own theoretical content, which differs from one case to another. Each expresses the thought of a measuring relation between norm and what it is a norm for, but this relation is itself objectively characterized, if we abstract from valuational interest, as a relation between condition and conditioned, which relation is set down as existent or non-existent in the relevant normative propositions. Every normative proposition of, for example, the form an A should be B implies the theoretical proposition only an A which is B has the properties C, in which C serves to indicate the constitutive content of the standard setting predicate good, for example pleasure, knowledge, whatever, in short, is marked down as good by the valuation fundamental to our given sphere. The new proposition is purely theoretical, it contains no trace of the thought of normativity. If, conversely, a proposition of the latter form is true, and thereupon a novel valuation of AC as such emerges, and makes a normative relation to the proposition seem requisite, the theoretical proposition assumes a normative form only an A which is bis a good, i.e. an A should be B. Normative propositions can therefore make an appearance even in theoretical contexts. Our theoretical interest in such contexts attaches value to the being of a state of affairs of a sort, to the equilateral form, for example, of a triangle about to be determined, and then assesses other states of affairs, for example one of equiangularity. In relation to this, if the triangle is to be equilateral, it must be equiangular. Such a modification is, however, merely passing and secondary in theoretical sciences, since our last intention is here directed to the theoretical coherence of the things themselves. Enduring results are not therefore stated in normative form, but in the forms of this objective coherence, in the form, that is, of a general proposition. It is now clear that the theoretical relations which our discussion has shown to lie hidden in the propositions of normative sciences, must have their logical place in certain theoretical sciences. If the normative science is to deserve its name, if it is to do scientific work on the relations of the facts to be normatively considered to their basic norms, it must study the content of the theoretical nucleus of these relations, and this means entering the spheres of the relevant theoretical sciences. In other words, every normative discipline demands that we know certain non-normative truths. These it takes from certain theoretical sciences, or gets by applying propositions so taken to the constellation of cases determined by its normative interest. This naturally holds, likewise, in the more special case of a technology, and plainly to a greater extent. The theoretical knowledge is there added which will provide a basis for a fruitful realization of ends and means. One point should be noted in the interest of what follows. Naturally these theoretical sciences may share in very different degrees in the scientific foundation and elaboration of the normative discipline in question. Their significance for it can also be greater or less. It may become plain that, to satisfy the interests of a normative discipline, the knowledge of certain sorts of theoretical connection has a prime urgency, and that the development and bringing closer of the theoretical field of knowledge to which they belong therefore plays a decisive part in making such a normative discipline possible. In building up such a discipline, it may be that certain sorts of theoretical knowledge play a useful and perhaps very weighty role, but nonetheless are of secondary significance, since their removal would only narrow, but not wholly destroy, the field of the discipline. One may think, for example, of the relation between merely normative and practical ethics, see above, 15. All the propositions which have to do with making practical realization possible, do not affect the sphere of the pure norms of ethical valuation. If these norms, or the theoretical knowledge underlying them, were to fall away, ethics would vanish altogether. If the former propositions were to drop out, there would be no possibility of ethical practice, or no possibility of a technology of ethical conduct. It is in relation to such distinctions that talk of the essential foundations of a normative science must be understood. We mean thereby the theoretical sciences that are absolutely essential to its construction, perhaps also the relevant groups of theoretical propositions which are of decisive importance in making the normative discipline possible.